something happened at Sturgis this year that the postcards will never show you, and the state of South Dakota just put a number on it. According to South Dakota's own Department of Public Safety, the agency responsible for counting every vehicle that crosses into the Black Hills during Rally Week, traffic for the 2026 Sturgis Motorcycle Rally landed around 318,000 vehicles. That's roughly 8% below the rally's own 5-year average. Not a ghost town, not a collapse, but a real, measurable, state-confirmed dip in the single biggest gathering in American motorcycling. When the agency, whose entire job is counting motorcycles, tells you fewer motorcycles showed up, that's not a vibe riders are picking up on social media. That's a hard number, published by the state. And the city of Sturgis itself saw this coming before a single bike rolled into town. Back in December of 2025, months before the rally even opened, city officials built their financial planning around a smaller payday than the year before. The projection, roughly $2.24 million in rally-related revenue for 2026, down from $2.63 million in 2025. That's not a rumor, not a guess, from someone standing outside a bar on Main Street. That's the city's own budget, written down in black and white, before the first tent stake went into the ground. So the question isn't really whether attendance dipped. The state already answered that. The real question is the one that should matter to every rider watching this video, and every brand that's spent decades treating Sturgis as gravity, something that just happens every year no matter what. Why did the numbers move? The rally almost didn't survive its own beginnings. World War II brought gas rationing that nearly ended the whole tradition before it had a chance to become one. For a few years in the early 1940s, getting enough fuel to ride cross-country wasn't just expensive, it was rationed by the federal government. And the Jack Pine Gypsies kept the event alive on a smaller scale until the country came out the other side of the war. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it means Sturgis has already lived through exactly this kind of test once before. A moment where the cost and difficulty of simply getting there threatened to shrink the whole event down to nothing. It didn't die then. It came back bigger than ever, once the post-war economy opened back up and gas stopped being rationed. That history is part of why so many people in this industry treat Sturgis as untouchable, because the one other time its survival was genuinely in question, it came back. By the 1990s and 2000s, Sturgis had transformed from a regional hill climb into the biggest single gathering in American motorcycling, and the manufacturers noticed. Harley-Davidson built entire marketing calendars around it. Dealers timed model reveals to it. Sponsorship money poured in from every corner of the industry because Sturgis wasn't just an event anymore. It was the 1 week a year where the entire American motorcycle culture proved, all at once, in one place, that it was still alive and still growing. That's the era most current riders actually remember. Wall-to-wall Harleys down Main Street, concerts every night, a local economy that turned Sturgis, population under 7,000 people, into a town that could rival a mid-sized city's economic output for 10 straight days. That's the version of Sturgis this industry has been implicitly betting on for the last 2 decades. Bigger every year, or at worst, flat. Nobody built a marketing plan around the idea that it might shrink. Rewind for a second, because the answer only makes sense if you understand what Sturgis actually used to cost a rider, versus what it costs now. In Pappy Hole's era, the barrier to entry was almost entirely physical. Could your bike make the trip? Could you make the trip? Fuel was cheap. A place to sleep was a field and a sleeping bag. The rally grew, decade after decade, because the cost of saying yes to it stayed low enough that almost any rider willing to put in the miles could say yes. That's not the equation anymore, and it hasn't been for a while. Sturgis just used to be big enough, beloved enough, and habitual enough to absorb the difference. A hotel room in a town that fills to capacity for 10 straight days doesn't price like an off-season Tuesday. Camping fees climb, fuel costs climb, food, gear, event tickets, all of it climbs, because everyone selling anything in Sturgis during Rally Week knows exactly how much demand they're sitting on. None of that used to be enough to keep a rider home. Motorcycle news coverage, examining the 2026 Department of Public Safety numbers, pointed to exactly this shift. Rising costs finally reaching the point where, for a real and growing slice of the riding community, the math stopped working. Not for everyone, not even for most people, but for enough people that a state agency's traffic counters picked it up. Here's the part that doesn't get said out loud enough in this industry. That math didn't start at the Sturgis city limits. It's the same math that's been playing out in dealership finance offices all year. It's the same math behind the discounts, piling up on trikes that dealers can't move. It's the same math sitting inside a 7-year, 11% loan on a brand new touring bike, where the sticker price was never really the number that mattered. The monthly payment was. Riders have been doing this math in showrooms for 2 years now. 2026 was just the first year a state agency's own traffic counters proved they'd started doing it about a road trip too. Picture the version of this decision that's probably played out in thousands of garages this year, in different words, with different numbers, but the same basic shape. A rider who's made the Sturgis run 3, 4, 5 years running. The bike's paid off, or close to it. But this year, that same rider is also looking at a financing statement for a newer model they'd been considering. Maybe an 84-month loan at somewhere north of 10%. The kind of long-term commitment more brands have leaned on this year to keep monthly payments low enough for buyers to say yes. That rider is also watching gas prices, watching hotel rates in a town that fills up fast, watching every other cost of living stack up the way it has for 2 straight years now. Sturgis used to be the one thing that math didn't touch. In 2026, for a real number of riders, it started to. And that's what makes the Sturgis attendance number so much bigger than a rally story. A rider who decides Sturgis doesn't fit the budget this year isn't rejecting South Dakota. They're rejecting the assumption, the old, comfortable, decades-deep assumption, that riding culture gets a pass from the same cost pressure squeezing every other part of their life. For a long time, Sturgis felt separate from all of that. Sacred, almost. The one thing you didn't cut from the budget. What the 2026 numbers suggest, gently but unmistakably, is that nothing is separate from that math anymore. Not the new bike, not the loan, not even the pilgrimage. There's a second thread running underneath the attendance story, and on its own it looks like good news, until you set it next to everything else. Crash and injury numbers at the 2026 rally actually came in noticeably lower than the year before, down roughly 25%, according to South Dakota Highway Patrol figures released as the event wrapped. Fewer injury crashes, fewer fatal crashes. Fewer DUI arrests than the year's pace suggested. Taken alone, that's simply a safer rally, and nobody should want anything else. But put a smaller crowd next to a safer crowd, and a different picture starts to form. Fewer riders on the road during the single most chaotic 10 days of the motorcycle calendar generally means fewer riders taking the kind of risks that used to come standard with a packed Main Street and a full 10 days of parties, burnout pits, and everyone's guard down at once. A quieter rally isn't only a smaller number on a state spreadsheet. It's a physically different event. Fewer strangers, fewer bikes weaving through a crowd, fewer of the split-second situations that used to define what Wild Week in Sturgis actually meant. Some of that is almost certainly just fewer people, full stop. But it's worth sitting with the idea that the riders most likely to skip a trip when money's tight aren't necessarily a random cross-section of the community. They may skew toward exactly the kind of rider who was already being careful, already weighing risk the same way they weigh a loan term or a hotel rate. If that's even partly true, the ones still showing up may be self-selecting into a rally that behaves a little differently than the one from a decade ago, and the safety numbers may be measuring a shift in who's attending as much as a shift in how they're riding once they get there. It also raises a harder question that the state's crash data alone can't answer. Is a safer rally this year a sign that South Dakota's enforcement and awareness efforts are finally working, after years of the same agencies flagging the same problems every August? Or is it simply what happens when the riskiest slice of a crowd? The riders stretching the trip on a tighter budget, riding longer hours to save on hotel nights, cutting corners somewhere to make the numbers work, ends up being exactly the slice most likely to stay home when the math gets tight? Both explanations are plausible. Neither one is provable from the traffic and crash numbers alone. But it's the kind of question this industry should be asking honestly, instead of just taking the safer headline and moving on. There's a whole layer of this story that never shows up in a national headline, because it's happening to people whose names never make it into a state press release. Sturgis, the actual town, has a year-round population under 7,000 people. For 10 days every August, that population effectively multiplies by a factor most American cities never experience. And an entire local economy. Vendors, campgrounds, tattoo shops, food stands, temporary bars built specifically for Rally Week depends on that surge showing up at full strength. An 8% dip in traffic doesn't land evenly. For a national chain hotel, 8% fewer rooms booked is a rounding error on a spreadsheet somewhere in a corporate office. For a family-run campground that built its entire annual income around 10 specific days in August, 8% fewer riders can be the difference between a good year and a break-even one. The city's own December 2025 revenue projection, nearly $400,000 lower than 2025's actual number, isn't just a line in a municipal budget. It's a number that ripples straight down into every vendor who set up a booth expecting the crowd that used to be a given. That's the part of this story that rarely gets attached to a number, because it's harder to measure than traffic counts and easier to talk around. But it's worth naming directly. When riders do the affordability math and decide to stay home, the cost of that decision doesn't just land on the rider who saved some money. It lands on an entire seasonal economy built specifically around the assumption that Sturgis would keep showing up exactly the way it always had. None of this means Sturgis is dying. That word gets thrown around a lot in motorcycle content right now, and it's almost never earned. 88 years of continuous history doesn't end because one August came in 8% light on traffic and slightly under the city's own hoped-for number. The rally that Pappy Hole and the Jackpine Gypsies started with 9 bikes in a dirt lot survived the actual Great Depression. It is not going to be undone by one soft year of attendance data, however real that data is. But not dying and untouchable are two very different claims, and for most of Sturgis's history, the industry has been allowed to believe both were true at once. 2026 is the first year in a long time where the state's own numbers say otherwise. Sturgis isn't gravity anymore. It's a choice. A real one. Weighed against gas prices and hotel rates and everything else. Competing for a rider's discretionary dollar in a year when that dollar has been stretched about as thin as it's been stretched in a long time. There's a lesson in here for the manufacturers too, even though none of them show up by name in a state traffic report. For years, brands have treated Sturgis attendance as a free guaranteed marketing event, a week where riders would show up in overwhelming numbers no matter what, and all a company had to do was park a booth on Main Street and let the crowd do the work. That assumption baked itself into entire marketing calendars, entire product launch schedules, entire budgets built around a captive audience that was never actually guaranteed to keep growing forever. An 8% dip doesn't just mean fewer riders bought a hotel room, it means fewer riders stood in front of a new model on a demo course. Fewer riders had a face-to-face conversation with a dealer. Fewer riders made the kind of impulsive, in-person purchase decision that a crowded rally week has always been built to produce. If Sturgis keeps trending the way 2026's numbers suggest, that's not just South Dakota's problem to solve. It's a problem for every brand that's been quietly counting on this 1 week to do marketing work no ad budget could otherwise buy. So what actually changes, if anything, going forward? Probably not the rally itself, not the location, not the history, not the identity that's been built up over nearly 9 decades. What's more likely to change is who shows up and how they budget for it. If the riders skipping this year are doing so specifically because of cost, then the fix, if there is one, doesn't live inside Sturgis city limits at all. It lives in the same place every affordability story in this industry has been pointing for 2 straight years now. The price of actually being a rider in 2026, from the bike itself to the financing terms attached to it, to the cost of the trips that used to be the whole point of owning one in the first place. For decades, riders were told the ride was the reward, and the cost of getting there was just part of the deal. Something you didn't question, because questioning it would have meant questioning the whole culture. What the 2026 numbers out of Sturgis suggest is that a real portion of the riding community has started questioning it anyway, quietly. Not with a protest, not with a boycott, not with an angry post explaining why they're staying home, just with an absence. A traffic count that came in 8% light. A revenue projection the city itself had already lowered before the season even started. A quieter, safer week that might mean the rally is healthier, or might just mean fewer people were willing to stretch themselves thin enough to be there. That's a harder story to tell than a scandal or a viral moment from Main Street, because there's no single villain, no press conference, no one person to point a camera at. It's just a lot of individual riders all across the country, independently doing the same quiet math and landing, more often than they used to on the same quiet answer. And if that answer keeps repeating itself, if 2027 comes in lighter again, and 2028 after that, the story stops being about one soft year in South Dakota, and starts being about whether the entire culture built around this rally can survive the same affordability pressure that's already reshaping everything else about who can afford to ride. It's worth remembering, too, that Sturgis has already answered a version of this question once, back in the 1940s, when wartime gas rationing threatened to shrink the whole event down to almost nothing. It came back because as soon as the underlying cost pressure eased, the demand that had been there all along came rushing back with it. That history is the strongest argument against writing off Sturgis based on one soft year. But it's also a reminder that the rally's survival has never actually been guaranteed by nostalgia alone. It's been guaranteed by riders being able to afford to show up every single time the country asked them to prove it. In the 1940s, that meant waiting out a war and a rationing program neither the rally nor the riders had any control over. In 2026, the pressure is different. No war, no rationing card, just a slow, steady tightening of what it costs to own, finance, and ride a motorcycle in the first place. But the underlying test is the same one Pappy Hole's generation already passed. Can the cost of showing up stay low enough that saying yes remains the easy, obvious choice, instead of a decision that requires a spreadsheet? If you made the trip to Sturgis this year, you already know which side of that math you landed on. And if you didn't, if this was the first August in a long time, you didn't point your front wheel towards South Dakota, you're not an outlier the way you might think you are. You're a data point, one that the state of South Dakota already counted, whether you told anyone or not. Drop a comment either way. Because right now, your answer to that question is worth more than anything a press release out of Sturgis is ever going to say about it.